Good morning and good afternoon and evening, depending on where you are around the world, and welcome to the second webcast of Growing Old Around the Globe. Anne and I'm Sarah Kagan, Anne Shoemaker and I are very pleased to welcome you to this webcast and to discuss both issues of growing old around the globe and specifically to welcome our special guest, Dr. Paul Tang from the Drucker Center for Health Systems Innovation at the Palo Alto Medical Foundation. But before we get to Paul, Anne and I just want to cover some logistic issues, some sort of nitty-gritty issues about the course. Remember, we're coming to the end of the fourth week, so we're going into the last 2 weeks of our course. We will have a third and final webcast on July 2nd, and Katie Fike and Stephen Johnston will be joining us from Aging 2.0, so do be thinking about next questions. Also remember, if you haven't seen the announcement or read your email, that we have created a new and we hope pretty exciting extra credit assignment that can earn you a total of 2 points. That is, if you submit 2 of these extra credit assignments, which are worth 1 point each, you can add to your overall portfolio and peer review score. We encourage you, if you have the time, to take advantage of this extra credit assignment because our intent behind it is really to get you to share your perspectives with the broader audience of the over 8,300, that is 8,362 people who are currently enrolled in Growing Old Around the Globe. We're very pleased to have such high enrollment. It's much higher than our first launch of Growing Old Around the Globe last year. But one of the things we've noticed is that not many people have taken advantage of the video perspectives option that we've offered sort of independently. And in order to create a balanced extra credit assignment, we have given you the opportunity to gain extra credit for submitting a video perspectives. And that's a 5-minute video focused on one of the questions of the week for the course. And we've also, because we recognize not all of you will be able to create videos, we've given you the option of an essay that essentially answers the same questions, engages another person in the conversation of the question of the week, say, what is it to age well, this week's question, and to write that conversation up in essay form in no more than 1,000 words. So do take a look. The extra credit assignment is on the left-hand menu of the course page. We encourage you to think about that and to recognize that we want your participation and we want you, I think, really to share what you know and what you're seeing in your community, in your region, in your society, okay?
And other participants have been asking us, especially, if we could put out more experiences and good examples of aging well. And the experiences of other aging people or aged people anywhere along the spectrum, really your experience of aging. And that's the whole point of sharing your video perspectives and these essays. We don't want to present, we're only a small portion of the world. We're on the East Coast of the United States. We want people from all over the globe to be sharing their experiences, good or bad, things that have worked for them, their families, their communities, their societies, how they've gotten policies through, how they've done some maybe grassroots campaigning. Go ahead, share those experiences with us through video perspectives, on Twitter, in the discussion forums. That's the place where we really want to build a community with this course.
And don't forget our Facebook page. And Anne's point about our diverse perspectives within the course can't be emphasized enough. We have, as I mentioned, as of today, 8,362 participants representing 143 countries. Fully a third of our participants are from emerging economies. That means that we've got diversity in ethnicity, in religion, in socioeconomic status, in educational status. Anne and I have been very impressed by the fact that you are really quite an educated group of participants, and we'd love to hear more from you about locally innovative, locally successful solutions where you are around the world. That is sort of our summary of the extra credit assignment. And remember that we as staff will be reviewing that extra credit assignment and assigning points to it. We are asking you to submit it by the middle of next week. And that will give everyone who's participating in the course, because what you're doing is giving us permission to post it for everyone, that will give everyone in the course a chance in the last week and a half of Growing Old Around the Globe to visualize it, to read it, and to understand your perspective. Just another quick note about your contributions. The discussion forum has been fabulous. If you haven't had a chance to participate, we very much encourage you to do so. There have been some especially exciting threads started in this past week or so as we've been talking about aging well. And of course, our challenge is that we can all look at the individual interpretations of aging well, who is aging well, but we now need to take that up to a societal level, a community level and a societal level. What is it to see a community that's aging well? What is it to understand a society that is aging well? Take advantage of those discussion threads as an avenue to really get involved in the conversation. And we've made an announcement, but we did want to take a special opportunity to say that if you have an online resource that you'd like us to post in the resources and bibliography section, please do alert us to that. Someone started a thread that was entitled "The 2 Best Resources I've Found As Yet." That was very helpful because we went right in and posted them. We love to see what everybody else is reading. And toward the end of our conversation today, you'll see that one of the questions that probably comes out in Aging Well, considerations for aging well, is this idea that we've got to think about retirement, and that's been in the discussion forum, it's been on Twitter. We have an interesting new report here in America, co-created by AgeWave from Dr. Ken Dichtwald and Merrill Lynch, which was just published this month, and we'll be posting that link in the resources and bibliography section. Okay, and did I miss anything in terms of logistics?
No, I think we're good. We really want to encourage people, especially if you're new to something like Twitter or Facebook, to get on and start playing with it. We'll be posting a Talkback Thursday. It's a good way to kind of dip your toe in the pool that is Twitter and Facebook and social media. So we highly encourage participation on Twitter. Of course, it's not mandatory, but it is run and up throughout the year. We don't close Twitter, our Twitter account, when the course is over, so it does help continue our community and continue our discussions. And I know Sarah especially is constantly posting all new research and different articles concerning aging throughout the year. So.
And we treat Facebook the same way. And I will say, I'm a member of the over 50 set. Yes, in America, we get our AARP card at the age of 50. I've been getting many of them from AARP. And as a member of the over 50 set, I had a lot of questions about social media. Maybe that's just me, but perhaps some of you share that. Question about what is social media, should I be using it? Do know that you can control the privacy settings, and you don't need to post. You can just take advantage of what other people are posting on Facebook or are tweeting as a way of using social media for your own information, but without disclosing anything about yourself if you're concerned about privacy or just aren't interested in doing it yourself. And I think now that we're at the point of covering logistics, we're ready for the really exciting part of our webcast today, and that is to talk to our special guest.
All right, so we would like to welcome Dr. Paul Tang, Vice President, Chief Innovation and Technology Officer for the Drucker Center for Health Systems Innovation. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
And unfortunately, we did lose Monique Lambert, medical ethnographer, due to some technological AV issues. Hopefully, though, we'll have some of her participation. We can get some of her feedback after the webcast has been posted. So if you have questions for her, we'll pass them along as well. But Paul, can you talk to us more about the Drucker Center for Health Systems Innovation and your disruptive innovation linkages?
Sure. Thanks, Ann, and thanks, Sarah, for the invitation to participate. Just a word about the Powell Medical Foundation. We're essentially a large medical group practice, over 1,200 doctors in a large health system called Sutter Health, one of the larger ones in the country. The Drucker Center for Health Systems Innovation works at the health system level, so at the global context, and we focus on disruptive innovation. Now, this is the Clay Christensen term that talks about the kinds of innovation that really uses a different business model and starts with the problem to solve. So we started out by saying, which grand challenge are we going to tackle? In the running were obesity, which affects people around the globe, as well as aging. And we chose aging as our first incubation project, again, because not only is it a problem in the United States, but really it's a problem throughout the world. And I say problem in the sense of it's more of a challenge. We need to deal with aging in a far better way than at least we do in this country. So we start, as many innovation centers do, with ethnography, not deciding what we think the challenge is with aging, but how do people who are aging, how do they feel about their lives and what gets in the way? So unfortunately, Monique Lambert, who is our medical ethnographer, did this study, and she was not able to join us for technical reasons, but I'm going to report some of the results of her study. So she spent time with 27 seniors in their home and tried to understand what gets in the way of a vibrant, productive life after 60, for example. Most of the people she talked to were in their 70s and 80s, however. And one of the quotes from one of the women that she spoke with is very to the point. She said, the problem with growing older in America is your world dies before you do. And that pretty much states the problem. So that's the problem we set out to solve. And you could say then what our job is to open up worlds again. So one of the things in America in particular, we have this high focus on gainful employment outside the home. And so as you retire, no matter what age that is, and that's typically in your 60s, then you sort of lose your sense of self-worth because that's what our society is telling you your worth is derived from. That's not right or wrong, but that's far more of the view from an American point of view. And I think a lot of the other cultures from where viewers are looking at this webcast throughout the world probably don't suffer from that kind of emphasis on our productive, gainful employment. But in America, you sort of lose your sense of self-worth as you retire, and the consequence of that is when you need something, it could be as simple as a ride, then you feel like you're a burden to other people, including your family. So that's sort of the vicious downward spiral that that affects people aging in this society. And the unfortunate part is I represent healthcare professionals. By the way, I'm an internist. We don't really have that much to offer. And that's something that I think our society needs to do a better job at. In fact, America spends a less proportion on social services than medical care services compared to the other countries in the world. So we looked at this issue and how can we address this? And one of the things that was published around this time when we were looking was a paper by Carla Pearson-Odo at UCSF discussing the topic of loneliness. Loneliness being the perceived social isolation. So it's not necessarily one-to-one correlation between the number of social contacts and loneliness, it's how the individual perceives their social connectedness. And what's important is that about half of American seniors, so 43%, consider themselves lonely. And this is through 3 standardized questions. Now, the other implications of that is for the half of the U.S. seniors who consider themselves lonely, they have a 45% increased mortality at 6 years and a 60% increased rate of disability. And that's startling. So in a sense, loneliness kills and disables more people than smoking. But we as a healthcare profession or as a society have not spent enough time addressing this. In fact, if you look at the influences on preventable mortality, that is mortality that we know how to deal with, healthcare, the business I'm in, only affects 10% of that. Social determinants affect 15% and behavior affects 40%. So there's far more tools that we have to address the issues surrounding mortality in particular, and I would say well-being, than we apply. And one of the resources we don't apply in this country very well is community. So an individual is surrounded by family and surrounded by community. And the folks in this country will recognize that neighborhoods and communities are almost a thing of the past. Possibly are hurt by the whole technology in the sense of we can do many more things over the air, but not actually create this sense of community. So that's actually one of the things we are addressing with our program that we call Linkages. Linkages stands for Link Across the Ages, Link Across Generations. We have 4 components. I'm going to talk about 2 of them in this particular webcast. One is we call personal profile. And we think of it as everything that you as a healthcare professional should know about this individual, we call them patients, that we don't. And simple things like transportation, access to transportation is critical to not only your sense of well-being, but actually getting care, accessing care. Another important piece of information about an individual is their interests. The interests don't die as you grow older, yet they're an important part of your life. And as a healthcare provider, we should know that information. I think we would have a much better connectivity with people if we understood them holistically, their interests, what do they get out of life, how do we keep their lives vibrant. Looks like Monique may have joined us. So another piece then is one of the ways we address. Let me see if I can get. So I don't know who people are seeing, but I'm seeing an icon. But one of the ways we want to address community, rebuilding community, and address loneliness is by using a time bank. So that's not an idea we invented, but it's the notion is instead of a bank banking currency, a time bank banks time. So an hour of your time is worth an hour of my time, and we all get credit for what it is that we can do or offer to somebody else or enjoy doing, and hopefully they're one and the same. So if you like gardening and you want to share that with others, that's a way that you can volunteer an hour of your time or many hours of your time. Similarly, if I teach tennis or photography or like to go to the symphony, that's a way that I can volunteer time. What that does is we talked about earlier from Monique's ethnography is that people have a lower sense of self-worth because they can't share what they were gainfully employed at. But in a time bank, you can continue to share and get recognized for that. Likewise, if you do need a ride to the doctors, you can ask somebody who's volunteering to give people rides to give you a ride to the doctors, knowing that they're going to get an hour in return. Right. So your sense of being a burden also is lifted. Yeah. So you can see how this treats this sense of loss of self-worth and being a burden. Mm-hmm. Now, what we want to do to add to time banking is, because we have this personal profile and we know that you like gardening and I like gardening, if I'm looking for a ride to the doctors, we might match you with somebody else who is willing to offer rides but also like gardening. And lo and behold, we might create this social relationship which treats loneliness but also rebuilds community. So that's an example of something we're doing. We've started out in a community near us, and we're rapidly expanding actually because we are partnering with other community organizations. In fact, we have 18 partners, about a half a dozen of which are starting time banks using our linkages system to start time banks in their what we call micro communities.
So you're already seeing dissemination, Paul.
We're already seeing that, and we're working with some rather large organizations to try to spread that.
So
that's a short, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good segue. First, we should probably stop and introduce Monique. I think, Monique, you can hear us now, and can we hear you?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Absolutely, Monique. Welcome. And you're a medical ethnographer at the Drucker Center for Health Systems Innovation. And Paul was just telling us a little bit about the ethnography you did with seniors in your immediate area, looking at the sort of foundations that have led to the formation of linkages. So you're coming in at just a terrific time, in part because as we're listening to Paul, as a gerontologist and geriatric nurse, I'm really struck by the consonance, the fit of your work with the idea of what we used to think about in the 70s and 80s, social exchange theory, and the notion that part of the challenge of aging in our society, and in fact in many societies around the world, is that we lose social capital. We sort of lose our bank of funds as we age, particularly if our societies, as Paul has pointed out, are focused on gainful employment and economic productivity, as opposed to, for example, social productivity. We're really in a situation where people have lost social capital and as a result, have a risk for poor well-being, loneliness, social isolation, and of course, bad health outcomes because they've really had the social factors, what we call social determinants, the social factors that support health diminished and fractured. So welcome, Monique. And do you have any initial thoughts on linkages or the work that you've done?
Yeah, so thanks a lot. I'm really thrilled to be here. So, in addition to, your comment about the social capital one, which I think is a really good one, one of the key issues that we're really trying to do with the linkages platform in general is address this issue of discoverability. I like to think of it in terms of discoverability. One of the things that I've observed over the last 3 years working in the aging space is I really think we need to sort of reframe the way we are sort of thinking about older adults. Mm-hmm. It's pretty common for people to think of older adults in terms of their needs and their deficits. Mm-hmm. But having done the ethnography, it was pretty obvious to me because I was going into their homes and sort of looking at the context of their lives and sort of observing things about them that were amazing, is that it was becoming increasingly obvious that the talents, the skills, the capabilities which older adults have accrued over the last, 70, sometimes 80 years, are no longer discoverable to other people in the community because they are no longer sort of mainstream actors in the market economy, mm-hmm. which is one of the reasons why we decided to use time banking as a mechanism for creating an alternative to the market economy, because the market economy is based, as you said, on employability. Mm-hmm. And once you retire, you no longer become visible, at least not easily visible. Right. So an alternative economy, which is based more on your ability to use the time that you have to make your skills and talents and capabilities accessible to the rest of the community, we're hoping that that's going to be a mechanism for sort of recreating the social capital that seniors have lost.
Right. And Monique, that's so much in line with what we're focused on here in Growing Older on the Globe this mm-hmm. week. Our question of the week is, what is it to age well? And that, I think, is, Ann and I have been talking a lot about the fact that that is generally a question that's answered in an individual sense, but what you right. and Paul are underscoring mm-hmm. for us, and it's a perspective we really agree with, is that we've got to ask that question at a community level and a societal level. It's not okay to say, oh, look at that marvelous person who's an example of this aspect of aging well or that aspect of aging well, exception to the rule in our deficit-based model. but
Right.
rather to think about strengths within communities, families, communities, and societies.
And I
Exactly.
think a lot of times we look at, especially historically, older adults in their retirement as a time when they're, especially on an individual or a family level, it's that oral history. They're passing on the familial stories. They're passing along traditions, passing along, Paul mentioned gardening, so that sort of knowledge, that personal knowledge on a one-to-one basis with their families. And now we have this kind of diaspora of families across the United States.
And in many other parts of the world.
And many other parts of the world, because travel and with global businesses, people moving all over constantly, it's not that straight kind of familial line of passing down these resources and talents and skills that a lot of people, I think, saw as their one of their jobs post-retirement, the formal employment.
Right. Right. And we actually found in the research that, because one of the things I was specifically looking at in the ethnography was to what extent did family play a role in older adults being able to sort of effectively respond to unexpected health-related events. And one of the things that I found is that for the most part, I mean, because of what you just got to saying, the families are so sort of physically distributed. They're not actually that close, and even the ones that are close, because their lives are on a different track. They're working, they have kids, that they're out of phase with the lives of older adults. So the family didn't play as strong a role in the social structure of the adults that we studied that a lot of people, I think, would expect. So one of the things that made us think about is, okay, if you no longer have this sort of nuclear family to sort of rely on as a social support system, how do we actually create the conditions for the community, the physical community that older adults live in, to actually sort of be the social structure that seniors can fall back on, so to speak, but then they can also be strong contributors to. So we're really sort of looking at the community that is proximate to the seniors as the mechanism for actually sort of creating a more fulfilling and vibrant aging experience.
Yeah. You know, Monique, I think that's a great point at which to transition into some of our Old Globe participant questions. And one that we think both you and particularly Paul can address for us is this question of, given the idea, you've done it with time banking, other people are volunteering in their communities. We had one participant who said, Andy, you maybe want to just directly quote from that. Let's see if we can
the question
find
about policy.
The question about policy. So the larger question is, how do people engage policymakers to create effective aging policies in their often rapidly aging communities?
The question, I'll give you the context, was from an anonymous poster who lives in a county in the U.S. that is experiencing the fastest growth of the over 60 population in the nation. After leaving the corporate world and running for the local school board, they learned about local policy issues and the many challenges that this demographic shift is presenting due to the lack of adequate forecasting and planning. There has been little political will to address the reality of this growth, which has resulted in serious transportation and affordable housing problems in their county. What do the experts suggest as a way to successfully approach policymakers in this prosperous community to partner with those of us, mostly volunteer workers, who are working their tails off to help less visible, less prosperous growing populations to also age well?
A great question. Paul, perhaps you want to address that first?
Sure. It is a great question. I do a lot of work in Washington, and I find that the most useful track to addressing the problem that this viewer asked is to work with educating both the staff and the member, whether it's the staff and member in Congress or staff and member of your local city council. It's really having a better understanding, usually through data and evidence, about the problem to solve. So he mentioned, he or she mentioned that there's a growing aging population. I'm not sure everybody on the City Council knows that. I'm not sure they also think about the next implications. We as an entire society don't. So clearly any individual probably doesn't know a lot of the facts and figures. So education about the demographics, but also the implications of that demographics, just like I talked about loneliness, often is your ticket into opening up the discussion. And most people, once they have a better understanding of the problem, will open up and be more receptive to proposed solutions or an approach to working on it together. So the person says there's a group of folks who are worried about this. They're willing to volunteer their time. Figure out how to educate the council members or whatever level of government they're trying to address on the problems and the implications, and start that discussion. So instead of saying I want to do this, which often is met by no, is opening up with the educational approach is very effective, even in the halls of Congress.
And Monique, especially because you're a social scientist and because of your contact directly with people who are considered older, any thoughts on this from your perspective?
Yeah, I guess the thing that I would think of is I always like to think in terms of what are the influencing factors when you're looking at different sort of constituencies. So if you're looking at it from a policy point of view, one of the most important influencing factors is who votes. Seniors vote, right? So, to what extent do people in the legislature understand the extent to which they vote? I think at the federal level they understand that, but at the local level they may not really have the data. But I think step one would be to actually get the data and show the demographics of the people that vote. And I think from that point of view, it'll just be really obvious that seniors vote. And if people in the government see that data, then you say, okay, so then if the seniors are the ones that are voting, then the next thing you might want to consider is what they care about. So, showing them who votes, and it will be seniors for the most part. And then raising awareness about of those individuals who are voting, of the seniors who are voting, you really have an understanding, a really grounded understanding of what are the. And I think that's where most of the disconnect lies. It's really understanding that the issue of transportation is probably one of the most significant problems that we can address for seniors.
We're losing your audio a little bit, so I'm just going to recap what you said. You've emphasized for us that both data and voting are very important. And for those societies like ours here in America, but also other societies where the right to vote is a political power, people of all ages, but particularly people who are sort of that certain age, over retirement age, should be very conscious of using their political power in voting, and that in educating, as Paul has said, in educating policymakers, legislators about aging issues, that the data on who votes, and we do know that in many societies, older people are much more likely to be engaged and are going to vote more consistently and more often when we have votes coming up. They should use that power as a way to leverage education about the issue, and it is that's a very useful point.
Can I just add to the data? So we talked about transportation. It is one of the top issues in terms of an aging society, and even if you present the data of who needs to get where, simple things. We talked about going to the doctors. That's a small part, but what about going to the grocery store? How about going to church? All of the common things, and just plot out what does it take to get there. Know what it takes to get there by car. What does it take to get there by walking or by public transportation? The challenge will be pretty apparent right away, but that's the kind of data that would strengthen your case. And then, as the commenter talked about, then maybe you need to look at other forms of transportation. How do we get seniors to where they need to go to? But I want to not limit it to need to go to, meaning like doctors, but would like to go to so that they can have a richer life.
And that gets back to your point about community.
back to community. They are an incredible, or say we are, an incredible resource that persists. They just become invisible because society hasn't given them a way to participate fully as they used to.
Excellent.
And I wanted to add one more point to that, because I think the commenter mentioned this, is if you're living in an affluent community, like we're in Silicon Valley, and so this is considered an affluent community, a lot of times people will make the assumption that seniors that live in areas that are considered affluent, they don't really have any needs because they've got plenty of money. But actually what we found in our study is that while that may appear to be the case, it's actually not true. A lot of seniors that live in our community, I mean, they might live in some of the most expensive communities, in the country, but they tend to be, a lot of them are house rich but cash poor.
Yes.
Which means that, they have a lot of asset in terms of their real estate property, but those assets are not liquid. And a lot of them actually do live on limited income. But the observation that I made is that people make a lot of assumptions about seniors who live in affluent communities actually not having the same kind of needs that the sort of obvious underserved seniors have. And I think it's really important to unpack that in order to raise the awareness and the sensitivity of policymakers to really not just sort of dismiss those individuals as not really having any significant needs.
Monique, that's a very relevant point for us here in Philadelphia, for example. We're the second oldest urban center in America. Pittsburgh is the first, with over 23% of its population being over the age of 65. But here in Philadelphia, we have about 19% of our population being over the age of 65. And my colleagues at the Philadelphia Corporation for Aging, our area agency on aging, which is a social service component of our sort of non-governmental or quasi-governmental services across America, tell me that fully 40% of our elder population are living under the poverty line. And that's true in many places around the world. Older generations may look as though they possess a great many assets, but in fact, many of those assets are fixed. And that intersects with diminishing social capital in a very negative way. Again, getting back to this idea of what is it to age well at family, community, and societal levels, rather than just focusing on the typical interpretation of what is it to age well as an individual.
Exactly, that's right. That's
okay.
right.
And what are some of our other questions? I'm conscious that we're probably about 15 minutes out from the end of our webcast, and let's move on and take a slightly different topic.
I think this was a large theme throughout multiple discussion forums we wanted to bring up, and that's intergenerational conflict, and it actually does tie in, especially when we talk about politics and voting here in the United States. There was actually one comment in a discussion forum, I believe, from the week 1 webcast, and I could pull up exactly what it was, but someone had said something about the challenges of dealing with professionals in their 20s and 30s. And I asked them to expand on it, but we really didn't get into much of a discussion. But I feel like this intergenerational conflict has been a theme, especially of my generation, when looking at this age wave, the baby boomers, as they're coming into retirement. It's creating a large divide in our national community.
And another example, Paul and Monique, that may help you sort of frame your comments on intergenerational conflict, is that we've had a number of old Globers who've commented on issues of employment in later life. Is retirement something that we need to enforce? Is employment in later life necessary for the economic health of societies, particularly low and middle income societies? How do we think about issues of economic productivity as part of this larger frame of intergenerational conflict, which can be political, it can be social, it can be economic? Would one of you like to take a first approach at that topic?
I might go back to the name Linkages, which we deliberately named to be link across generations. And we're finding that, let's say, even in the time bank, we have people of all ages. We actually have a lower limit of 18 just because they're an age of majority, but we've had an applicant who is 10 who wants to join, but right now we can't accommodate them. We also have an interesting video on our website, innovation.pamf.org, that shows an event that had people of all ages. I'll bring up a new program we're just starting, which we call Linkages Advocate, which is a college volunteer program. So college students, and we could only take a quarter of the people who applied, will help us in many ways with the program of Linkages, which includes going to the senior's home, setting up, let's say, the technology, but also being our eyes and looking at what's the home situation, because that clearly affects their health and their well-being. But an important part, sort of again, it's another agenda we have in creating this college program, is we will then have people, as you mentioned, in their 20s, working with people of all ages, but in our target market of seniors, they will start understanding what contribution can we each make to each other. They'll learn how much we can contribute to them, whether it's professional advice or career advice or advice on many things, policy making. And I think the hidden agenda is that they will understand how the diversity in ages helps enrich their world, the society at large, but also their world in particular.
And Monique?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that the commenter actually used the word conflict, because conflict sort of suggests, well, it's kind of a negative thing, and it kind of suggests a sort of intentionality to it that doesn't, I mean, my observations of the sort of intergenerational dynamic, I guess that's the word that I would use, is that it's not so much a conflict, at least based on what I'm thinking. I'm not sure what the commenter was thinking as much as it is a dynamic. And it goes back to this whole observation of people at different phases in their life. Unless you're in that phase, you tend to be out of phase. I mean, if you think about people that have kids, who do they tend to hang out with? They hang out with other people that have kids. They don't tend to hang out necessarily with other friends of theirs that are the same age that don't have kids. And so it seems to be more of a phase thing, like what phase of life are you in? And then your sort of natural community tends to be other people that are kind of experiencing the same phase that you are. So it's interesting to think about it in terms of what does it mean to be out of phase but in the same community? And then what are the mechanisms that we can use to sort of not necessarily force people to be in phase, but look at being out of phase as a potential opportunity for creating new types of interactions within the context of community. But that's also one of the reasons why we looked at time banking in the context of the Linkages system, is we understand that people are out of phase. And so instead of trying to force people to do different things, we look at how can we actually create a system where we recognize that people are out of phase, but it actually gives them a reason to interact with one another, even though they might not normally do so. Mm-hmm. So that's the whole idea behind time banking, is it's not about trying to find your friends, so to speak. It's about service exchange. And we did that intentionally because if there are services that you have that you can exchange with another individual, or there are services that you need that you can acquire from another individual, our hope, and we have some evidence that supports this, is that you're not going to make a distinction on the service provider or recipient based on age. You're making decisions based on need or interest. And so one of the things that we wanted to do with the time banking is hope that people would get together and interact with one another through the service exchange, where that interaction may not have occurred via some other mechanism. So we were hoping that would be a strategy for doing it. And I just wanted to point out that there are other sort of mechanisms that are emerging in the aging space that I've actually studied specifically around this whole notion of co-housing. So there are people that are actually making proactive, conscious decisions to create communities, some of which are intergenerational, in the context of this sort of co-housing movement that is that's kind of emerging a little bit slowly. But one of the points that I wanted to make is we're starting to see evidence of new types of housing and living community arrangements emerging amongst people that are actually trying to solve this issue of intergenerational conflict. So if people are opting into living in a co-housing community, and the whole idea is they're trying to create intentional community where older adults and younger people will actually together, um, intentionally live together, then the whole idea is that people are really trying to reap the benefits of having that intergenerational population.
That's excellent, Monique. And just again, because I know we've had a little bit of a dropping down of your microphone on occasion, let me just recap. You've given us great language around out-of-phase interaction, so out-of-life phase interaction based on service needs, interests, and other things. And one interpretation of that is the co-housing movement here in America, where people are intentionally choosing to live with people of other generations and often outside of their families. This is important in part because we do in America, and I think this is true in many places around the world, have the myth of the multi-generational family, but we have to remember that our life expectancy is the highest it's ever been here in America and in most places around the world. And as a result, we are seeing many more generations in families and communities than we ever have before. So that idea of 3 or 4 generations in a single family living together in the same homestead or in the same domicile was in some ways a myth because people just didn't live that long. We have to remember that it was only the middle of the 20th century, the 50s and 60s, that we saw life expectancy creep above 60 years of age. This is an illustration that's very useful for Old Globe participants and allows us to see things. And I wanted to mention that we will post a link to the Pew Report on the Next America, which outlines the idea that what we think is intergenerational conflict, particularly here in America at a political level, and this may inform dialogue in other societies around the world, is really not the case. Many generations here in America agree about things like the economy, like health and social welfare, and in part we have to wonder whether the media have amplified this idea of intergenerational conflict, when in fact it's the normal dynamics of people who are from different historical cohorts coexisting, living together, and determining what's important to them across the lifespan. Your comments, both you and Paul have offered us really important comments. And shall we go to the medical research question, in part because it gets to Paul's point that we in America, and this is true in other societies around the world, we spend much more on health research, medical research, than we do on development of understandings of social determinants of health, social welfare, and social care. We had a question, I think, that asked specifically about medical research.
And limited funding for aging related research and or research that focuses specifically on the aged and how to address the issue of limited research dollars.
Yeah, so perhaps both of you could respond in terms of biomedical research, but also in terms of social research. Because Paul, you made a point that we think is critical to our course and to innovation in aging societies, and that is that we have to consider social determinants of health and well-being. And most societies don't put a lot of money into that.
And unfortunately, that's true of our society as well. I think NIH, for example, does have an increased emphasis on expanding the kinds of people who are enrolled in their clinical trials. For example, women are underrepresented in clinical trials. So are seniors. And both of those segments of society are very important, and we need to do more research that involves both women and seniors. The other thing is, it may or may not, science may or may not fund all that information, all those studies, but maybe we all can do it at the grassroots level. So in our the majority of the country now uses electronic health record systems. If we capture some of these social determinants of health variables, then we'll have more data to look at, even if they're retrospective data. that is actually one of the outgrowths of, there's a piece of legislation called High-Tech that enabled or incented all of these healthcare providers to have electronic health record systems. And in order to participate, you had to capture these demographic variables that deal with social determinants. So we are building up the data set in order to do studies about the implications of having an older population. What can we do, and look at some of the interventions. So I think we're going to build this data set up, and we just need to do some more fundamental research in looking at the consequences of aging and what we can do to intervene. And the intervention doesn't have to be just medical. That's the whole point. We can bring, to the first commenter's point, we can bring this information of how lack of transportation gets in the way of well-being and health. So this is some of the ways we should be able to use this new data, particularly if we have some of these social determinant variables encoded in it.
Mm-hmm. And Monique, any thoughts before we move on to our last check of the question?
Sure. I think I totally agree with what Paul was saying about being able to sort of figure out a way of capturing the data around social determinants, because once we have the data, then we can actually start to ask some good questions. I like to think of that in terms of how do we actually use that kind of information to start thinking about the business case for really, focusing on the aging problem, because, believe it or not, if you actually have a strong business case, that actually tends to be a pretty strong influencer. But the second thing that I think is important, and it's one of the reasons why we try to talk about aging different, in a different way than talking about deficits and needs and that sort of thing, is I think that there's a very pervasive sense of aging in the United States that of ageism, where there's where there's a diminishment of aging that consciously or subconsciously happens. So its importance in a lot of policymakers' minds may not be elevated sufficiently. So I think that people's perceptions and attitudes towards aging needs to be reframed by the way we talk about it, and also what we know about it and what we write about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a critical piece as well.
That's terrific, and that's a great lead into our last question. Anne, we've got a question that was just submitted.
Esmeralda asked the question, if there's any specific educational programs for children on aging issues, to kind of broach the subject of aging to the younger generation.
So maybe a way to change attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
What a great idea, in fact. And of course, as you know, it shouldn't be a book about aging and children. It should be infusing the value of a diverse age group in children's stories. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And clearly, that can be introduced. But if we have a publisher that takes interest in this and has solicits writers to write these children's stories and just talks about diversity. One of the greatest strengths about America is diversity of all kinds. We need to understand that age is one of the diverse assets that we have, resources that we have, and take advantage of it. And what better way to teach children than through stories, whether it's movies or cartoons or children's stories. Would be great. That's a great idea.
And that's certainly true. Diversity, because by most statistics, we're only a moderately diverse society. There are many more diverse societies around the world. And that you're pointing out that one of the ways to capitalize on intergenerational dynamics is to draw on other sources of diversity.
Absolutely.
That's a wonderful suggestion. Monique, any thoughts on this idea of reaching out and influencing how children understand the lifespan and aging?
Yeah, actually the first thing I thought about was StoryCorps. Are you familiar with StoryCorps?
Yes, perhaps you could explain StoryCorps, because we do have people from 143 countries around the world. So StoryCorps is an American interpretation.
Yeah. The reason why I say StoryCorps, and StoryCorps is a public radio sort of innovation where they record family members talking to one another, and a lot of times it's intergenerational. And sometimes it's an older, like a grandparent talking to a child, but the whole idea is to create this sort of context for the real stories to be communicated to one another and they actually record it and they broadcast it on the radio. And the reason why I think that that's such an effective way to do it is because kids really learn a lot through stories, as opposed to, you're trying to teach them something. But if they actually are able to kind of hear a story, especially from an older adult, and especially if it's somebody that they're related to, it sticks with them in a way, and it kind of plants a seed that I think would be more difficult to plant and sustain if you were trying to communicate it some other way. So I think StoryCorps is an existing program, and it's an existing way to actually tell the stories that I think can make a huge difference in terms of facilitating this intergenerational interaction.
So broadening that out to a global level, the idea of creating intergenerational stories and opportunities for storytelling across generations, and creating a mechanism to record those stories for wider distribution is perhaps one mechanism to think about model programs that could be localized and taken to a wide varieties of communities and societies around the world. Anne, as we're checking our feed from the discussion forum, any last questions?
We just had a question specific to linkages and time banking, and one of our posters said they were enthralled with the video they saw. They went to your website and they want to become more involved. They want to know more about the current locations, where you are, and any plans for expansion.
Thank you to that poster. We started out in the city of Mountain View, California, which is nearby, and we've been essentially pulled to other locations around the San Francisco Bay Area. And actually, I'll be going down this week to the Los Angeles area, where another group wants to use our Linkages system, which is a software system, as they expand throughout the LA County area. So we are thinking, as we build this up, and we're sort of in an early phase and just emerged from pilot. We want to make this available to others. That's not where we are now, but we would like to make this system available to others because, as everybody knows, this is a challenge that we're all facing throughout the globe. But this is a way to use technology to do this human connection, to enable this human connection and rebuild the community that we talked about.
So right now you're in California, Paul, but perhaps what we could suggest is that old Globers who are interested in the time banking concept should follow the development of linkages on the website, and as you're ready to disseminate nationally and perhaps internationally, they could look to your website for information? Absolutely, because we've already been speaking to people in Oregon and Hawaii and Ohio, so it's already spreading in terms of the interest, and we just got to build up the infrastructure so we can support that. Terrific. Well, your website is available on our course page, and that's a great way to end our webcast for today. I know Ann and I are just buzzing with all the ideas that we've discussed. And Paul and Monique, thank you very much for joining us, particularly because it's quite early on the west coast of the United States. We appreciate you getting up so early for us. No worries, and thanks for the invitation. Thank you. We appreciate it. Thanks so much. And thanks to those of you who are participating in Growing Old Around the Globe. We'll see you on July 2nd for our third and final webcast of the course. Take care. Bye-bye.